If Natalie Harp went to law school, she could have written the Supreme Court opinion today about Donald Trump's attempt to seize control of voting by mail in the United States. It's one of those opinions issued on the court's so-called emergency docket, which means the case was not fully argued to the Supreme Court, but all of the Republican appointees to the Supreme Court decided that the case was so urgent that it needed to be ruled on immediately, with none of them willing to actually sign this thing today, which leaves it very likely to have been written by Chief Justice John Roberts, whose first sentence could only be written by a Natalie Harp-type Trump groupie, someone who believes in the Trump fairy tale of a Never Never Land where Donald Trump was never, ever, ever indicted and charged with conspiracy against the United States of America for trying to illegally overturn the 2020 presidential election. Donald Trump is the biggest and most famous election criminal in American history, the only president of the United States in history to call the Secretary of State of Georgia and ask him to commit an election crime.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have.
The Supreme Court and Natalie Harp are just totally cool with that. The Republican Supreme Court. What you just heard is one of the crimes that Donald Trump was charged with in both a federal indictment and a criminal indictment for violating Georgia state law. And so it took Natalie Harp-like delusion for the Supreme Court opinion today to begin with this first sentence. The president recently issued an executive order regarding election integrity. No, he did not. Donald Trump issued an executive order attempting to corrupt elections. Donald Trump issued an executive order trying to prevent me from voting by mail and for preventing 30% of Americans who vote by mail, at least the ones who vote Democratic. Donald Trump issued an executive order creating a list of voters who would be allowed to vote by mail, a federal list of voters who would be allowed to vote by mail, created by the president. Created by the Department of Homeland Security, which, according to the Supreme Court, is the president. Donald Trump is personally in control of everything the federal government does, according to this Supreme Court. And only the people on that list, created by Donald Trump, would have Donald Trump's permission to vote by mail. No one else would have that permission to vote by mail. Donald Trump's executive order specifies the design of the envelopes for voting by mail. That is a direct intervention for the first time in history by the President of the United States in our voting process. Those envelopes are controlled by the states and the counties that produce those envelopes. And so far, the Republicans on the United States Supreme Court think that all of that's okay. The United States of America has never had the slightest problem with the integrity of voting by mail. And so there is no need for a presidential executive order about election integrity on voting by mail. And there's also no conceivable constitutional basis for a presidential executive order about election integrity, so-called, because, as the judges in the lower courts handling this case pointed out, the Constitution gives the President of the United States no role in elections anywhere. Every word that follows that completely false first sentence of the Supreme Court decision is as willfully naive and childish as that first sentence. The Republicans on the Supreme Court say that it was just too soon for states to object to Donald Trump ordering the Postal Service to come up with rules for mail-in ballots because when the lawsuit was filed, the Postal Service had not yet come up with that rule. The Supreme Court says if Donald Trump convinces the Postal Service to issue an illegal rule, only then can the states sue Donald Trump and begin to object to that. The Republicans on the Supreme Court wrote, quote, Federal courts review final rules, not proposed rules. If the Postal Service's final rule harms the states, they may challenge that rule. Now, Supreme Court opinions are written in advance of their publication, sometimes long before their publication, but this thing was supposed to be an emergency. This thing was supposed to be very present tense stuff, very up to the minute stuff. And so the Supreme Court opinion dated today says, quote, if the Postal Service's final rule harms the states, they may challenge that rule. The Postal Service issued their final rule on Friday, and this emergency Supreme Court opinion today doesn't even know that. That's the kind of fantasy land John Roberts is living in. And the Postal Service rule issued on Friday says that the Postal Service will not deliver my mail-in ballot if they don't like the envelope that I use. The long-held motto of the post office, which was engraved over the entrance of New York City's Farley Post Office, the largest one in the United States, is neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Delivery of the mail has always been a sacred federal duty, and interference with delivery of the mail is a federal crime. The three justices appointed by Democratic presidents, of course, dissented. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote, quote, the order thus requires a fundamental overhaul of the state's existing mail-in ballot systems, changing from a state-administered process to one in which the federal government controls who gets a ballot and whose vote counts. John Roberts will get his mail-in ballot. Clarence Thomas will get his mail-in ballot. Donald Trump will get his mail-in ballot, and he'll use it. Their ballots will be delivered. But what about mine? What about yours? The fight against Donald Trump's voter suppression executive order will continue in court now that the rule the Postal Service issued on Friday is final. The Supreme Court will not be able to say it is still too soon to fight that rule in court. And so it will be fought in court. And tonight, the governor of the state with the largest number of mail-in ballots in this country said, quote, wow, the Supreme Court just let the Trump administration move ahead for now with its plan to disenfranchise voters across the country. California will be suing again to block these Orwellian rules from being implemented. So the very same set of facts might be back in front of the Supreme Court soon. And it will be another case for the realists on the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan, versus the Natalie Harps of the Supreme Court, the believers that Donald Trump can do no wrong even after they have seen the wrong, even after they have heard him do the wrong in that phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State. Nothing said by anyone in the Iranian regime during Donald Trump's war with Iran has angered Donald Trump and his White House staff as much as something Senator Jon Ossoff said about Donald and Natalie.
While the sailors on the Lincoln fight his war, while he fruitlessly drains our munitions and oil reserves, the president sleeps through his meetings. He golfs and trades stocks. See, he doesn't want to do the job. He wants to build his ballroom and travel with Natalie on their apparently defenseless flying palace gifted by the Emir of Qatar.
The White House attack dogs came after Jon Ossoff viciously for that reference to Natalie. And that White House reaction created even more attention to what Maureen Dowd's Sunday column in the New York Times calls Natalie's magnificent obsession. It was reporting by Maggie Haberman that revealed Natalie Harp is the perverse, racist supplier of one of Donald Trump's social media posts depicting President Obama and Michelle Obama as animals. It is one of the few Trump social media posts that was judged too evil and sick and racist and deeply perverse for even Donald Trump to post, and so it was taken down. That racist post, made possible by racist Natalie Harp, takes its place in the rare collection of Trump social media poison that even Donald Trump could not defend. Natalie Harp's social media post about the Obamas was so dark and deranged that Donald Trump took it down, but kept the racist who posted it closer to him than anyone else in the White House, including his wife, who made what can properly be now described as a surprise appearance at the White House. She is the first lady in history for whom presence at the White House is a surprise. She had not been seen publicly by anyone, anywhere, in 31 days. When she presented herself on Thursday at the height of the Natalie Harp scandal and spoke these inane words.
Good afternoon. I heard you missed me. Here I am.
Chris Whipple literally wrote the book, actually the books about White House chiefs of staff, and is an authority on White House organization and the operations of White House personnel. This weekend, he told Alex Witt this about Natalie Harp.
It's an extraordinary relationship, unique I think, in this White House. Natalie Harp is clearly a troubled young woman with a need to idolize Donald Trump. But the real danger here is Trump's fixation on her. In a normal White House, presidents have a so-called staff secretary who tees up reliable information on every side of an issue so that a president can make decisions. But in this case, proximity is power. And so Trump is getting his information from someone who wants to please, only tells him what he wants to hear. And so he's getting his information from, in effect, from a kind of fact-free fangirl. And that's nobody's idea of a staff secretary in a healthy White House.
It is an unhealthy White House. It is a dark and deranged White House. And the dark and deranged section of the United States Supreme Court, which might as well be led by Chief Justice Natalie Harp, actually pretends to believe that Donald Trump spends his day working on, of all things, election integrity.